everyone. Today's question is, what are the challenges of being part of the LGBTQ plus community and being part of the Catholic community, and how can you overcome them? Which aligns with the Solidarity Catholic social teaching value. For today's episode, I'm really excited to be joined by George White. Welcome, George.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Just to get started, I think it would be really good to kind of explain to the listeners and viewers sort of a bit about yourself, George, and sort of the journey you've been on and where you are today.
Great. I'll try and make it quick as I speed through 27 years of life. So originally, I am from Leicester. I was born to my parents in 1993 as one half of a set of twins who are non-identical. We're not a religious family at all, but we were sent to kind of the local Catholic schools because our families knew that they were good. And whilst I was there, I chose to become a Catholic. So I chose to be baptized in the school chapel at the age of 16, which I tell all the kids about nowadays. I'm a teacher now, but they all find it kind of bonkers. But some of the teachers at my school, I chose to be godparents or sponsors. They really are at that stage. And it felt like the right thing to do. It was just a community that I genuinely felt very much a part of. So me and my sister actually were baptized at the same time in the school chapel. I guess we didn't know necessarily, certainly from my point of view, but I didn't know necessarily what it meant then to be Catholic, what all that was involved in that. And I remember applying to a Catholic university, to Heathrow College, after my A-levels, so about 2 years after I was baptized, or a year and a half. And I remember putting that, I'd recently become Catholic at my school on the application, thinking like, well, that's surely going to tick a box or two there. And I have no idea whether it did or not, but I did end up going there. And that's when I really started to kind of get to grips with what it means to be a Catholic. What do they believe? What kind of things do we do on a daily basis? What kind of things might we do yearly? What kind of things might our faith kind of require of us? But it was also the time I first became aware of other LGBT people. So I am transgender. At the time I went to university as female. I was assigned female at birth. Now identify as trans male. So it was the first time I'd ever encountered other LGBT people. So, very obviously trans people, people that actually then began their transition. And I remember being totally, in awe of what they were doing, because I'd always known that I was different. And I think I'd sort of resigned myself to an early age to say that, transition probably wasn't going to be possible. It just looked like quite a lot to do. So the experience that I had at that point was all very separate. I could see people transitioning. I could see people being kind of openly gay and in relationships, and I could also see people being religious. And I'm sure there were people that were doing both, but I guess at the time it wasn't necessarily obvious to me. I sort of kind of grew in understanding the faith, and I then started to volunteer with a religious order that work with young people, so the Salesians of Don Bosco. And at some point, I eventually kind of moved in. I moved into a retreat centre in the north of England. I say north, it's just near Macclesfield. I don't know if that actually counts, but with religious priests and brothers. And it was then kind of, I was supposed, what was I, 22, I believe I must have been at the time, at that kind of age, that I just realized that I couldn't ignore the questions I had surrounding kind of gender. I'd always thought I was a boy as a child. I'd grown up to realize I wasn't. Sort of decided that it would be too much to transition, and just thought I'm just going to have to put those questions to the back of my mind. But couldn't, because I thought when I was in that retreat center, I felt a genuine kind of calling to be one of the priests or brothers and join that religious order and have a vocation there, which I obviously couldn't. So at that point I had a total breakdown of kind of faith. I've got to say, I always felt connected to it in terms of practical things. So in terms of volunteering and, running kind of summer camps or whatever it might be. But I never necessarily felt connected, or that I had a really deep relationship with God. And at that point, I just figured, well, I definitely can't do this anymore. It simply doesn't make sense for me to be around and do these things. And I had got the idea in my head, I was going to go off and be a teacher of religious education in a Catholic school, living the kind of life that I'm living now. And I thought all of that has to go. So I just felt everything was totally stripped back. But that then allowed me to become a bit more honest and explore those questions that I'd had always about gender identity. And I felt like I chose between the two for a while. So I think I tried, first of all, I tried to have no faith, and then try and answer my questions of gender identity. Weirdly enough, during that time, I actually went to Jerusalem, which is one of the most profound experiences of my life. But I was very kind of almost, I don't know, like, I really struggled with the faith element. I just thought I'll just sit back and be quiet during this bit and go along for the ride. And had this, kind of weird experience in the Garden of Gethsemane where I was like, oh, not my will, but yours, maybe it's your will that I was born female. Maybe that's what I'm going to have to accept. Couldn't do that. So then might have tried to go kind of and have a look and see, what transition would be like. So spoke to the GPs, all whilst still kind of, applying training to teach and then actually working in a Catholic girls' school in West London. And I guess the final kind of point came, I knew that I had to do something about it that year. And having seen a counsellor and having spoken to my parents and other people, I realised, that this is something I'm genuinely going to have to explore, both faith and identity, but in particular at the moment, identity. And it was when working at this girls' school, 2 of the pupils came out as trans, and the head teacher wrote a letter kind of supporting them, saying, we're going to use their preferred names, and the pronouns that they choose, and that's that really. They're made in the image of God, so we don't expect anything else. And it got a load of backlash from kind of like Catholic media and the news. I say Catholic news, not the news, but just kind of general Catholic news in the UK, where it was kind of slammed for doing so. And I thought, my gosh, I'm going to have a real issue here because I'm a teacher of religious education working in a Catholic girls' school. Imagine that coming out. So fortunately, by divine providence, a job came up at my old secondary school where I'd been baptized. And it was actually a maternity leave contract, and it was one of my friends going to have a baby. And she was like, you should apply for this. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to come back to Leicester, or, I don't know if it's necessarily right for me. But of course I applied because I felt like it was probably always my true destiny to go back there. So I went for an interview pretty much like a couple of days later as Mr. White rather than Miss White. And it was traumatic trying to find a suit in that time, I can tell you, very quickly, one that fits properly. So we spoke about the interview and kind of said, what kind of questions people might have, whether I need time off for surgeries or anything like that as well. So I've now been there for 2 years, teaching religious education, and I am an openly trans kind of member of staff. At first, there was this kind of idea of maybe not sharing it as openly, or just not discussing it, as teachers obviously aren't expected to discuss their personal life, and I don't go into many personal details with kids, but I am honest about who I am and how I've struggled with that. So yeah, I think that's it generally.
That's inspiring, because it's like I've seen like people around me are kind of discovering themselves and getting to grips with like who they are, and like I'm in that stage now where I'm watching other people kind of go through that and trying to work out who they are, and it's nice to know that there's sort of a light at the end sometimes.
Yeah, and I read about kind of stuff like this all the time, and I'm looking into it in schools and how we can do it and how we can do it, make inclusion better. And I literally just before starting this talk, I just saw a tweet that said, how many of you, what age were you when you first had an openly LGBT teacher, or someone that worked in one of the schools that you attended? And lots of people are actually saying at university. And I guess even for me, I know that some people, obviously perhaps it's different, but for me, I never had an openly LGBT member of staff, not at primary school. There was suspicions that somebody was gay, and I remember people kind of talking about it in such a way that would just be awful. And that person obviously felt that they couldn't come out because they were working in a Catholic primary school. Then at secondary school, I don't remember anyone necessarily. And then at university again, there's still no obvious kind of representation there. And I think it's just important that, you can actually see those people as you grow up and know that things will be okay.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, because I can't think of any of the teachers that I had. Maybe it's just because I went to a Catholic high school that I kind of sort of, I can't really, I don't think any of them were. I don't know. Obviously some of them might just not want to
Yeah.
share. But
And I suppose that's the kind of difficult line, isn't it, that we sometimes cross, I think, as educators. I'm obviously not going to tell them everything about my personal life, but I do also think, representing the community that I do have a bit more of a duty to actually let people ask some questions or to explain what my story is, rather than just, wait for them to hear it somewhere else, or wait for me to hear that they're talking about it behind my back.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, of course you don't have to share, but I know lots of teachers, when we're giving examples or talking about things, we might end up saying something like, my husband or wife or my children, or, so why should someone not have to be careful about what they say, whereas someone else has to police everything that they say?
Yeah, and I think seeing someone around you that is part of that community or is a role model for that, it does help sort of kind of help someone to get to grips with it and actually maybe even start a conversation about it and start kind of asking those questions for themselves, which it does take that sometimes.
I've definitely found as well, in my experience, that actually being open and honest with the kids has been far more rewarding, I think, generally for everybody involved, than it has been to be quiet about it. Because when I first got there, I just literally just started hormones. I hadn't had chest surgery. I looked very much like a sort of, a masculine woman going into a role and being called Mr. White. And of course, you know what children are like children will ask questions, of course, as they would ask questions of anyone that came in to teach their classes.
Yeah.
And that, it's been far more fruitful, and I've seen kids being far more respectful of, differences, perhaps across the year group. I've seen that the boys are wearing kind of nail varnish. That one girl particularly likes seeing the pride mask. I have a pride face mask. She just likes seeing that, and she says it makes her feel seen and heard. And I just think that those things are important. We obviously can't pretend that these people don't exist, because we do, and we're doing our job roles just as well as those who perhaps are not LGBT.
Yeah. So like looking back at that, like your journey from it through transition, like what were some of the like main challenges that you came across, and what were some of the things that like perhaps surprised you about that? Like were there some things that you expected to happen and not necessarily were the case, or was there something that happened where I don't know, it's something went particularly different to how you expected?
I guess, to be fair, I feel like, when I first started this job role that I've now been in for 2 years, my first job as Mr. White, and obviously it was at the very beginning of my journey. I'm sure if I went into a school now as Mr. White, no one would know, and therefore, there wouldn't necessarily be all these questions or anything else. But I remember thinking at the time, telling my parents that I was going to come back and work in Leicester, and live in their house. And they were just baffled. They were absolutely baffled by the thought that that I would want to do something so obviously public, whilst also transitioning. And they're kind of like, kids are just awful. And I guess I didn't have any expectations that kids would be awful, or that it would be difficult. But I did know that there, of course, would be some kind of challenges. But what kind of struck me kind of pretty much straight away, even without giving too much information away to students, that lots of them were actually probably far more understanding than I think older people might be. If someone said miss instead of sir, there would be 15 kids trying to correct that child, and only one of them trying to make it a joke, which was quite positive, because obviously, when I was at school, I started secondary school the year after Section 28. So when I was at primary school, Section 28 was actually in. meaning, of course, that people couldn't be public about homosexuality. They couldn't necessarily be public about their own relationships. They couldn't necessarily show a lot of support for LGBT kids. So I was actually kind of overwhelmed that generally in the classes or in the corridors, that the vast majority of young people were really good at getting kind of pronouns right, titles. I remember once someone called me Miss. They were in the form that I'd taken over, and they had a Miss previously, and she was just utterly mortified, and she was like, "I'm so sorry. It's not because you look like Miss. It's just because we had Miss here yesterday," or whatever it was. And that kind of took me by surprise at the very beginning, because I guess I thought, I don't know. I guess I thought that it would be much more like the other way around, that maybe only one or two kids could understand it, and whereas there might be 15 or 20 of them that don't.
Mm.
The school have been exceptional as well at honouring any kind of appointments I need, and I've never had to take time off work for anything such as kind of hormone injections or hormone blood levels, or in fact surgery. I've never had to take any time off like that, so I wasn't really sure how that would be. They've been great at that, which has been ideal, because it meant that I could recover from chest surgery properly, and it means that I can, of course, have my blood levels checked and make sure that everything's kind of going as it should be. Challenges, I'd say, I think at the moment, certainly probably in Catholic education, I think there's more of a desire to kind of hide or suppress conversations around being LGBT, maybe perhaps with other things as well. But schools obviously have to deliver relationships and sex education. They also really, they should be delivering a kind of broad spectrum of what's going on in the world, so that we know how to behave like responsible citizens when we leave. And I think, in my experience, schools are very shy about talking about LGBT issues, certainly in a very positive way. I think we're starting to produce lessons on gay relationships, what the church says about it, and HIV and AIDS in RSE, but generally they seem a little outdated, and I think that's probably because there's not someone working there that necessarily knows about all of these things particularly well. So one of the challenges, I guess, would be, for me, I think I am the only openly LGBT member of staff, which can make it quite difficult. It feels almost like the onus is on you to educate people on that, where of course it shouldn't necessarily be. And the more that you're kind of directed into it, the less attention perhaps other people pay to it as well. So I think that's been a kind of challenge, and it's about how do you get people engaged. I think often for children, they might be afraid of being seen as LGBT, and maybe for staff, they just sort of think they can't necessarily assess how important it would be, and of course they've got many other things on their plate as well.
Yeah, I think it could be quite. I think that's really good though, because I think it must be really nice having the support of students and staff, and having them sort of back you in a way, like having students sort of go out of their way to make sure that you feel comfortable, because I think at my school, I mean, I don't want to drag it down the ditch or anything, but I feel like the one behavioral problem that we would get all the time would be stuff about, like, it's not that the students are particularly bad, it's that they're gobby and horrible. So it's like, I think that's really nice, that I guess you feel like you like really fit in, and it's sort of, you feel very comfortable. Like, I can just sort of tell that you feel very comfortable, which is really nice.
Yeah, like I said, the vast majority of kids have always been absolutely fine, and they're really understanding, and they really do make an effort if they get something wrong, or they're interested in a way where they'll be polite and respectful about kind of asking appropriate questions, and sort of, I don't know, just generally being very kind of comfortable to talk about it as well, which is often quite helpful. So I do, when there's chance to do so, I do make sure I kind of talk about my experience as a trans and Catholic teacher with them. Just the same as, you know, there are other people in the school that work there that are not Catholic, or that might be Muslim, that might be, you know, divorced, remarried. They might have taken on holy orders. You know, there's loads of different people in our school, and you know, I think what helps build a relationship with kids is open honesty, really.
Yeah.
And I just try and put that at the forefront of what I'm doing. And you know, I think everyone has this impression, you know, I can certainly see on TikTok, everyone has this impression that RE teachers are all like 60, probably none like, you know, dress really old and have absolutely no time whatsoever for children, apart from trying to make them holy and save their souls, you know, which of course I'm very interested in. But also, you know, I want to make sure that kids feel loved, supported, and you know, are then able to see why some behaviors might not be appropriate in the world around them.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, actually, because our RE department is nothing like that. It's kind of funny. Most of them are younger teachers now, which is, I think, so helpful.
And to be fair, almost any RE department I've ever worked in has had people that don't fit the stereotypical mold.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's they were a nun and then they left because they found someone that they were in love with, whether it's you know, kind of openly LGBT, whether it's you know, married, divorced, a single parent. You know, I work with so many people that don't fit that kind of traditional mold that we're given in Catholic schools, who are still, you know, fantastic educators and are teaching, you know, young people about the world around them and the faith in which you can believe, but not be a sort of, you know, not be this kind of model of holiness and, you know, this unrealistic expectation of being a kind of, you know, perfect disciple. You know, that none of them were perfect. That's the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think as well, like, obviously with the media and things like that, I think as it's becoming more and more open and much easier to talk about, it's becoming easier for sort of students to sort of gauge that, and same with teachers as well. I think just because of the generation we're in, it's so much easier to kind of have conversations and be more accepting and just sort of be yourself in a way.
Yeah,
Which is nice.
and there's a lot of that we don't necessarily see if we come from a different community. You know, we don't necessarily see it. At the minute, we've got a Muslim woman teaching RE in our department, and she is wonderful. And you know, the kids very often, without thinking, wouldn't necessarily understand some of the Islamic practices, but you know, she takes the time out to explain them, and I just think, you know, that's exactly what education is about. It's about broadening the mind to the people that you will meet out in public, and what is and is not appropriate to say, and how you can still support each other despite having different beliefs about whatever it might be.
Yeah. So, like, as a student now who's just gone to uni, like, there's obviously a lot of support now for students that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. For example, at Sheffield, there's if you are part of that community and you don't feel comfortable living with others, there's rooms that you can have with other people of the community, which is, I think, really great. But coming from a Catholic high school, that support wasn't as evident, and I think as a high school student, there wasn't much going on within sort of STEAM's work that allowed students to start those conversations, and we've kind of touched on this already. It is slowly improving, but as an educator, where do you see the major gaps, and how would you change education to improve support for the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, we absolutely have, and you know, you're right. It's obviously, you've just left school, and I work in one. I don't feel old at all or anything. But yeah, it's not great yet. And as I said, I think part of that is there's a real kind of disconnect between, you know, students who necessarily maybe want to learn about it or need to, and what people that are leading these Catholic institutions feel is acceptable to say and what's not to say. So there's always this sort of implicit understanding that, oh yeah, well, you know, LGBT issues, you know, we'll talk about that and we'll do this, we'll do that for, you know, these groups of people. But really, you never actually see it explicitly, which I think is part of the problem. So for me, there's a couple of things that I think help embed inclusion in schools, and I suppose we're looking at a few of them now. I'm certainly looking at them, and I've kind of passed some ideas on to senior leaders. But I'd suggest some things, some things are really obvious. So first of all, I would avoid a boy-girl seating plan. So actually, there's a lot of things that you could think of, and instead of saying things like boys and girls, you can literally just say, okay, people or class, year 9, whatever it might be. I tend to try and stick away from either boys and girls or doing a kind of distinctive seating plan in that sense, which it sounds fairly obvious, I think, when you say it, but not everyone has necessarily realised that can be upsetting for some people, or it can just be uncomfortable. So these are like the small things I think that can make a difference. Maybe as well, on that kind of line, you might be able to have a mixed PE class once or twice, kind of athletics or something together, where you can just do the mixed. But I think generally, I guess some of the things that we'd have to look at, I think in particular for Catholic schools, that there should be something both in the pastoral side and in the curriculum side. So I've created resources for LGBT History Month, which we've used in prayer this previous week to February half term. Just a couple of things that go with the morning prayer slides that go out to each form, about what LGBT History Month is, why it's important, and how the school and the church can support LGBT people. I'd guess as well, really, the church is actually discussing this quite a lot at the moment. There are constant kind of articles that keep popping up about, Pope Francis blessing a nun that works with transgender people, him ringing a gay couple who are seeking to adopt. That these things should be built into maybe PHSE or relationships and sex education as well. That there is this conversation. Okay, yes, we understand what official church teaching is. Does that mean we can't do pastoral ministry? No, it doesn't. Okay. So I'd suggest as well, maybe something, in terms of pastoral, things like using Christian or religious resources that are also LGBT. So there's the Book of Queer Prophets. There's another book that's similar called Unorthodox, and they tell the story of people that are religious and also queer or also LGBT plus, and that might be helpful to have, just an excerpt of that maybe in a PHSE, in a reading group, and making sure that someone is kind of genuinely trained up really in terms of dealing with the pastoral sides of what an LGBT teen might be feeling. Curriculum wise, I think it would be making use of kind of LGBT icons, and making sure that they're not kind of just written away from history. I think we often have this idea, don't we, that history is in some way kind of westernized and whitewashed, and that actually, we could be talking about Alan Turing in computer science. We could, be doing a module on Freddie Mercury in music. We could look at Marsha P. Johnson in sociology, or whoever it might be, and just making, obvious and explicit use of material that highlights what LGBT people have contributed to society. That doesn't mean, of course, then that you have to kind of ignore everyone else, but I think it makes it a little bit easier for us if you see those people around. I don't remember ever kind of studying or hearing about anyone that was LGBT when I was at school, and looking through stuff now, it seems to be almost the same. So you don't have to spend hours on it, but if you put Alan Turing in a lesson, you could mention that he was gay, and also the punishment he faced because of that, not even 100 years ago. That actually, time has moved on very quickly at the moment, but not necessarily everyone's thought has. So I think making use of such things like that as well would be ideal. It's difficult because I think it involves perhaps having some conversations with people that are outside of school, who can maybe provide some support for people. But I'd say probably as well, schools maybe need to have a look at maybe employing an inclusion officer as well. I mentioned two things. I did a talk previously with Million Minutes in November. I mentioned two things that I think were specific really to leaders. So this would be maybe the cardinal, bishops, and people at the very top, the senior kind of end of schools. One thing that's common in an interview, certainly for a teaching of religious education post, you may be asked what your views are, what you would do if a pupil asked you your views on homosexuality, with the expected answer being something like, I would give them the church's teaching, not share my own opinion, but make it very clear what the church believes. An acceptable answer, of course, is that the conscience actually in Catholicism is the most important, and if someone's conscience allows them to believe that that's okay. But the expected answer essentially is you're going to reaffirm church teaching, and no other subject seems to be questioned in that way. I've not heard of anyone that's been asked a kind of question on abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, in the same way that they would be asked about homosexuality. So I think that's one of the first ways in which you're highlighting at the moment that there's something here that's not quite forward enough. I think there's not quite forward enough thinking in terms of pastoral support, because kids have lots of questions about everything, not just being gay. And the second thing I suggested for leaders as well, the document that is endorsed by the cardinals and the bishops for who can apply for the role of practicing Catholic, or the roles of head teacher, deputy head teacher, and head of RE, which have to be a practicing Catholic. And I use practicing with the inverted speech marks because it denies anyone that doesn't fit a very kind of specific sort of kind of a list of holiness, really, almost. It discloses people that are it discounts people that might be divorced, discounts people that might be openly in an LGBT relationship or transgender. It essentially kind of gives a list of things that only certain people meet the criteria for, and the truth is these people are working in our schools anyway. People that have IVF, somebody that's perhaps had an abortion, somebody that's perhaps divorced, somebody that's perhaps gay, somebody that's perhaps trans. These people do work in our schools, and they do those roles anyway. And to have this sort of list of requirements doesn't really fit the mold, I don't think, that Jesus took when he chose his leaders, who all had their faults and difficulties in some way. So I think there's a couple of things that can be done by individuals, such as changing seating plans, maybe such as bringing in a particular famous LGBT person into a lesson or a scheme of work that you've got. And then I think there's things that leaders can do as well, which is, adapting perhaps inclusion policies to make sure that they account for all types of people and all types of behaviors. And also then, of course, having a look at a bit deeper and maybe addressing this, addressing kind of anything that seemed kind of, I don't know, I suppose implicitly unfair towards certain people.
Yeah, and I think it is just adapting things. I think that's the core thing that links all of those things together. It's adapting things that just haven't changed with the times. And I think by doing that, by making those little changes, it really does help someone, and it really does sort of make people feel less uncomfortable if they're kind of questioning themselves. And I think it is just taking those little steps, and it is just sort of breaking down the barriers that are sort of marginalizing people in a way. So
well, I think a lot of generally what tends to happen is I think a lot of people actually believe that there's no need to be so explicit about things because we're all implicitly feeling the same way, and I'd say from experience of being an LGBT person that isn't the case, and that actually I know that there's this whole kind of sort of idea of, well, people shouldn't need to come out, or we don't need to have labels anymore, just be who you want to be. That is great in principle, but we are not currently there yet. And the fact that you are then not talking about these things and not kind of showing support of them means that the kids that are one of them, or the kids that feel connected to that particular thing, can see that they're not necessarily welcome here. Which I think it's important. I'm not saying I don't hold 3-hour-long question and answer sessions about everything to do with trans identity, but I have explained how it's kind of impacted my faith, or how it's impacted my career, and how some things perhaps could be better, how I've been surprised by certain things. And as I say, kids and staff generally respond much better to that, and that they know how to support me kind of further into the process, or they know how they can kind of support other people that are around them that might be experiencing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that is all I have time to ask you today. I wish I could ask you more, and I wish I could carry this on because it has been really, really interesting, but I can't do that.
That's okay.
But so if people are inspired and want to get in contact with you, where can they find you on social media? Where can they follow you?
I do tweet from at GEOWLE, but my main account that I talk about, being a trans and Catholic teacher is on Instagram, which is at Trans Catholic Teacher.
There we go. So if anyone at home is listening and they want to go find George, that's how you find him. Also, a massive thank you for George for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And hopefully we've managed to inspire some people to get out, start some action and make some noise. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.
Thanks, Tom.